Welcome to Book Bites, a book club podcast for developers. We're reading Code Girls, the untold story of the American women codebreakers of World War II by Liza Mundy. And today we're going over part 3, which is titled The Tide Turns. I'm Adam Garrett Harris.
I'm Jen Luker.
I'm Safia Abdallah.
All right, so I really like this part. I think this is probably my favorite part out of the whole book. Besides the introduction where they're getting the secret letters, that was really cool too. But like some really cool stuff happened in this chapter where they actually start winning the war.
One of the new things that I learned in this chapter that I didn't know before is that there was an American version of the Bombe, which I didn't know.
Yeah, how do you pronounce that? Because it's like bomb with an E on the end.
I call it Bombe, but I don't know if that's just a little bit too pretentious.
No, I like it because I say bomb in my head, but it sounds weird to say bomb because it's not a bomb, it's a computer.
Yeah. I feel like we should go to Google for the official download on this.
Yeah.
But yeah, that was one of the things I didn't know. I think I'm so used to hearing the story of Turing and the Bombe that, again, all of this stuff about the American side of the cryptographic effort is new to me.
Isn't it fascinating how much of that story we get from the European side and not from the American side?
Yeah, it is quite a bit fascinating. I wonder why. I wonder if it just has to do with kind of American intelligence's security culture and their own, like, OPSEC around stuff. Or, I don't know. I can't speak to that.
Maybe it has something to do with the release of 007 and popularizing British spy campaigns.
Yeah, so I'm just reading here on Wikipedia, finally looking this up right now, that it was designed in Poland. It started in Poland, and it was the Bombe, which is Polish. So that's probably where it gets its name.
So we should be calling it the Bombe.
Yeah. Or however you say that. I don't know. I thought it was fascinating, this set of women who were creating the electronics for it. And they didn't really know what they were making. But if they paid attention, there were like 24 things on is like the circular thing they're making with 24 things on it. Which is how many letters are in the alphabet.
Yeah.
And so it wasn't hard to figure out that they were making something to crack codes.
I thought that was kind of an interesting part of this is the like separation of concerns between the people working on, I guess you could call it an assembly line for the actual like Bombe machines, and then the people who are working on like the cryptographic and mathematical effort. And there were all of these kind of like silos, and there were only a few people who kind of had the big picture understanding of what was going on. Kind of to draw analogies between today, I do know of some like software teams that do function like that, where they're very siloed by like product offering or like what service they are responsible for. And there's very few people who have an understanding of the like full scope of the work. So I thought that was kind of like an interesting team/engineering setup.
Yeah, no, that reminds me of something I learned recently called Conway's Law. And it's this idea that the way you write software is going to be based on how your organization is structured at your company. And so if your company has these different departments, then your software will be or tend to or should be organized based on how the company is split up.
Yeah, Conway's Law is probably one of my favorite, like, I guess, engineering or software philosophy type things. I find it really interesting because it kind of underscores the relevance of the people and culture over the actual, like, lines of code.
Yeah. What else?
There are some interesting anecdotes about some of the kind of sexism that the women experienced just moving forward into the later years of the war. Like, one of the stories that was highlighted was a situation where basically there were women who were based in like a manufacturing/assembly facility in Dayton, Ohio. And there was another group of women who were working in Washington, D.C. And there was a situation where they were transferred from Dayton to Washington to do some work and stuff there. And as they were kind of like processing the transfer, the individuals, the men who were processing them, sort of automatically assumed that the women were there in DC from Dayton because they had like done something wrong or what was considered immoral at the time or unbecoming of a female officer. And were like, made them like literally wash windows when they were supposed to be like these mathematicians and code breakers. And it wasn't until another officer saw them and pointed out the fact that they were like the ones doing the code breaking that was like brought to an end. So yeah, it's kind of, highlights one of the things that I think has been a consistent theme throughout this book. And then is also, I think, something that is a reality that a lot of women experience even today, is that like going to work is going into battle with allies and enemies. Like within the same team or even the same company, you might have individuals who like support you and sponsor you and behave like some of the more like supportive characters that we've read about in this book, none of whose names are coming to mind at the moment. But then you might also have within those same institutions people who are like holding you back or, still judgmental in that way. So it's like you never know what side of the coin the person you're interacting with is going to land on. Is it going to be someone who kind of respects you and understands and appreciates your achievements and your position and all of the challenges you had to overcome to get there? Or is it somebody who's going to like want to knock you down a peg? So,
and not only that, but it seemed that those same people would respond in different ways based on what was going on, either with them or with the war effort or whatever. So it seemed that even if you could peg someone as being one way, that, they were accepting of you, maybe in 3 weeks they wouldn't be.
Yeah. It's, I don't know what the word for it would be, but it's just, you kind of walk into a situation and you have no control over how you'll be perceived.
Yeah, that story was, I can't find it at the moment, but that story was crazy to me. I don't know how they got put in the position where they were just washing windows when they should be doing real work. Like, who made that assumption? And I mean, it was great that someone finally came and said, no, they're really important. We need them to work on important stuff. But if that person hadn't come, they could have just been stuck there.
Such as life.
The joys of assumption.
Yeah.
I can't tell you how often I was seen as the secretary when people would walk in the door and my desk was one of the front
Oh my gosh.
ones.
Yeah, that stuff's that's the stuff that gets you.
I'm trying to get a lot better about this. Like, for instance, I ran into a couple recently, and the woman was wearing a React Rally t-shirt. And so I asked if she was a developer instead of like, I don't know. This is a silly example.
Assuming it was her husband's.
It was her husband.
Yeah, no, it's a real thing.
I really thought she was the developer.
Yeah. And I think that's like a good skill to practice, is like being proactive about not defaulting to the assumption that might not necessarily like be true all of the time.
I'm noticing like little things like this. Another example is I was talking to a pharmacist about my son's doctor, and she said, well, yeah, just call him and let him know. And it's a female doctor. And she just made the assumption that because it's a doctor, it's a male. That one's really weird to me, that's still an assumption we have.
That all doctors are dudes.
Yeah.
Well, it wasn't until, the 1930s that women were allowed into certain medical fields?
Yeah. Yeah, and it talks about at the end of this book, after the war, there's a GI Bill where they can use that to go to college, but a lot of these women couldn't get into the colleges they wanted to learn the things they wanted to. They said, hey, we're holding those spots for soldiers. And they were like, I was a soldier. I was in the waves. They're like, well, too bad.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things where it's like, certain prejudices become like institutionalized. Because if there is one thing I know, especially from looking at it in the lens of like Black civil rights and the advancement of Black people in America, there was like nothing more significant to the development of the middle class and like economic prosperity in that era than the GI Bill and everything that it enabled people to do with respect to getting like education and housing and all of that good stuff that people need. And, you know, the fact that all of that wealth and resource was not accessible to this one group of people, it becomes generational and it impacts, you know, women several decades later. On to cheerier topics, one of the things that kind of fascinated me, or sorry, not to just like jump off this like very serious topic that should be discussed, but one of the things that I thought was kind of interesting also was talking a little bit about the engineering effort involved in the building of the bombs, because they were building many of them. And I thought it was interesting that they had, you know, like standard parts that they would get from like, you know, commercial providers, but then they also had like custom made parts that needed to be made. And you know, it reminded me of like modern software engineering where you have, you know, like standard packages or APIs that you interface with, you know, like interfacing with like a file system that's a standard API in many cases, or like interfacing through HTTP or REST. And then you've got like stuff that's just like custom built for your use case. Like they were talking about like diodes that had to be custom made, certain kinds of vacuum tubes and how they had to like integrate and assemble all of these parts and the maintenance effort required to keep this. They almost seem to describe it as like a very delicately put together system, like running, and like their engineering logs where I think they called like the first prototypes Adam and Eve or something. And another thing I noticed that was kind of interesting is that they had anthropomorphized the computers. So they would be like, if they were talking about Adam, they'd be like, he had a bug today. He was feeling a little cranky. And the same goes for Eve, which is interesting because I also tend to anthropomorphize bugs or things I'm dealing with when I'm writing code. So yeah, it was kind of interesting to see like the engineering process involved in like physically assembling the hardware for the bomb.
Having dived into IoT a lot lately, I can also relate to that from an actual hardware perspective and not just the software side. Having to try to combine various parts and pieces and make them work and then kind of, you know, rig them with bubble gum and, you know, duct tape to try to make them work anyway. And not just, you know, talking about having to custom make the hardware itself, but sometimes it's random things like I've got this water float switch that I'm using to fill up my fish tank when the water level drops too low. And I've had to like custom make essentially a one-eared clip to go onto the edge of my fish tank because I couldn't find one commercially.
Nice.
So it kind of reminded me that 3D printing is very much the same way. It's custom making various pieces in order to make our things work together properly.
Yeah, and I didn't totally understand what was going on, but I think I remember some sort of job where you like put this wheel on and then you sit there on a stool and wait for it to like pop off and hit you. And then you like get up and put it back on. And that was like a job to sit there and constantly fix it. Do you remember that?
I remember working in a button factory.
You worked in a button factory? Like...
Hi, my name is Joe. I worked in a button factory. One day my boss came to me and said, Joe, are you busy? I said, no. Push this button with your left hand.
I remember this. Not from this book.
No, but yes. It was a thing back in the day.
Maybe
Safia's too young.
I think
Probably.
I might be. Yeah.
So anyway, Joe continues, and boss keeps coming, and, you know, left hand, left foot, right foot, head, whatever other body parts you can figure out how to push a button with. And you just keep pushing the button. And it's like a physical, like, song that you do in front of an audience, and it gets really hilarious. And then eventually you say, yes, I'm busy, boss.
I'll have to look this up.
Try to find a link for the show notes.
That's going to be odd and awkward. We probably should just cut it all out.
Still looking to see if I could find that part where you would sit there and...
Yeah, it's like, the point is that, you know, if we've come up with songs like I Work in a Button Factory, like, I don't see it as a real far-fetched thing that we probably came up with it because of something as similar as wait for the wheel to pop off and then put it back on.
Yep. Okay, so one of my favorite chapters is the one called Teddy. Chapter 14, Teddy, not Teddy. And it's a story about Dot's brother. So Teddy went in like some of the worst battle that happened during the war. Let's see, what battle was that? During Normandy. He was like storming the beaches of Normandy. What
made that chapter your favorite?
So he was in this unit that almost everyone died, and he was reported missing in action, and everyone just assumed he was dead. And then it turned out he had survived, and he had this kind of crazy story about how he survived. The vehicle was in, just got blown by this rocket launcher, and he was just kind of knocked out. Then he just kind of woke up and followed some dudes, and then he like passed out again, and then he woke up in a hospital. It's just crazy. I guess because I really like Dot as a person in this story. Like, she's really the most consistent storyline throughout this entire book. To see her brother out there and she's working to try to save him. There's really nothing she can do to save him, but through a lot of luck, he actually does make it.
Not only does he make it, but he kind of gets to skip one of the worst battles he was ever in. So from the very beginning, you know, he kind of gets knocked out, and then he wakes up long enough to walk a few miles, and he gets knocked out again and wakes up in a hospital. Like, sucks that he got knocked out and he had injuries, but like, he got to skip it. Maybe he skipped some of the emotional damage.
Right. And then he gets to eat a nice meal in a Belgian restaurant.
Yeah. Although I don't think that discounts, like, the gruesome aspects of having to face war at such a young age. Even if it was, like, brief, I think just, like, the very act of being in that kind of conflict is traumatizing enough. And I don't know if it's necessarily, like, the more war you see, the worse off you are, or if it's just, like, encounters with that kind of, like, violence and terror have an impact on your psyche, regardless of how much...
And it's also sad how young these men were and how untrained they were, and then going into the worst battle of the war.
Yeah, because I think I was going to add on to, I was kind of getting into this notion about, like, the psychological trauma of war. You have psychological trauma that you experience in addition to, like, physical trauma, like injury, death, when you're in the battlefield. But I think there's also, like, the aspects of psychological trauma that were discussed when it came to, like, the, like, stress and mental wear of the people who were just, like, the women who were just, you know, stationed in the US and just responsible for deciphering codes and stuff like that. Like, it's different ways that you are mentally harmed by war, whether you are directly in combat or just kind of having to process those aspects of war. I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on it, but I think there's, like, an interesting thing there about the different ways it affects you depending on your engagement with, like, combat or just war stories or all of that.
You know, there's always going to be varying degrees across not just people, but also in experience. I think that from, again, my limited experience, I mean, people can get PTSD from just being in a car crash, let alone having to deal with the day-to-day, on and on, of dealing with those horrors. And some of it becomes, you become desensitized to a sense, and it just becomes one long experience with staccatos of horror that then define the experience for you, but no matter how you cut it, the emotional and mental and physical damage of it all definitely adds up.
Yeah. But yeah, so you feel like the kind of backstory for her brother added some like depth to the Dot character, even though she's like a real person who existed and is not just a character in a fictional book or something.
Yeah, and it's not just that story. There's a lot of different stories of code breakers whose husbands or brothers or fathers are out there fighting the war, and they actually sometimes help save them by cracking a message, or sometimes they don't, and they just hear about their death. So another thing I thought was really interesting is in the next chapter, chapter 15, talking about the surrender from the Japanese. And it was talking about how Japanese translators were really rare in America at that time. And so there were basically 3 types of translators they had. And some were like military people that they had sent to like learn Japanese in, I guess, at like training places in California and Colorado. And then others were scholars, and some were missionaries who had actually lived in Japan. And so the last 2 categories were really interesting because they learn the language because they love the people, the culture, the place. And then here they are working to fight against the place that they love.
And this is where I get a bit angry about the fact that they couldn't find Japanese translators. However, they were perfectly fine with locking up Japanese Americans in our own version of camps.
Internment camps.
And that wasn't just people that were born and raised in Japan and moved. It was people that were born and raised as Americans that just had Japanese heritage. Not that one of them makes it any better.
Right. Yeah. And, you know, those people, even if they had asked them to come help translate, they probably would have been in the same boat of like, they might have some, at least, you know, if that's their ancestry, they're probably going to have some, I don't even know how to word it.
It's like not even necessarily love as much as just the language comprehension.
What do you mean?
For those that actually traveled and studied in the country, yeah, you're going to have people that did so because of their appreciation of that culture. But the people that were already here, even if they were born as Americans, may or may not have already had the language comprehension skills based on whether their families continued speaking the language or not. However, I felt like they had this huge pool of people, maybe not huge, but they had this large pool of people that they wouldn't even utilize or work with or talk to or let them live in their own homes and experience life on their own. So they had to find other weird ways of getting Japanese translators besides our own people.
So I like this one sentence. I'm not even sure how to parse it, but they get the message, the surrender message early because like the Japanese don't have a direct way to communicate with the US. So they're going to go through Sweden. So send the message to Sweden, then have Sweden send it to the US. And so we intercept that from Japan to Sweden and go ahead and translate the message. So the translator's, you know, working on it and like everyone's crowding around her. And so this woman says she saw what was going on and she went over there and she was like, I just put on my colonel's bars or whatever you wear when you're a colonel and told him to get the hell out of there and leave her alone. And I was like, that's so awesome nice. That she's a colonel. She's like, and I'm sure this is just years later that she's telling this story. She's like, you know, colonel's bars or whatever you put on. And also, this probably goes back to some of the stuff we're talking about before. It's like, she probably had to put those on to get the respect to tell people to get out.
Speaking of respect, this is kind of jumping back a little bit.
Yeah, go for it.
There was some stuff that happened in the beginning around the like illustrious Agnes Driscoll character that kind of confused me. So they were talking about like needing to push her out or like get rid of her in the context of the new Bombe effort that was going on.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it was that about, because I was having trouble kind of tying that with other parts of the plot with respect to like Agnes Driscoll.
That was in part 2, right?
Yeah, there's like, this was like in like the first chapter within part 3. There was like a brief bit, which kind of surprised me. They were like, oh, we need to get rid of Agnes Driscoll. But I don't know if that was the same kind of scenario that happened in part 2, but just retold in a different context, or there was like another situation where she was pushed out. I had trouble kind of parsing that part of the plot.
They were always pushing Agnes Driscoll out.
Yeah. I love the part, I think it's in the last chapter, where someone was walking past her, and this woman walking past her was trained by someone Agnes Driscoll didn't like. I don't remember who. And she had good reason. And she just kind of hissed at her.
Oh, gosh. As someone who had to deal with a bit of similar situations, but in junior high and bullying, yeah, that doesn't feel good to be on the other side, but...
It's just kind of...
Oh, was his name Raven?
Oh, the Frank guy?
Yeah, the dude who was like, yeah, she was smart until she had a car crash, and now she's a hag.
I feel like I need to Google him and see what happened to him.
He probably went on to a very happy, illustrious career and, you know, retired comfortably and died in his sleep surrounded by his family.
Yes.
He's got a Wikipedia page. This is strange. There's a picture of him on his Wikipedia page, and it's one of those eerie feelings where you connect a story to like a face, and then just the fact that there's, you know, that kind of uneasy feeling you get when you've got like a face to match a story to.
Particularly when you don't like him.
Yeah, he definitely does look like the kind of guy who would say something like that. Anyway.
Yeah, I don't understand it either. It just said she had to be neutralized. And so I don't know if that's talking about the same thing that was mentioned in part 2 or something else.
And that's such an incredibly awful language to use.
Neutralized? Yeah. However, I mean, if you think about the previous stories and the different things that we discussed, when it came to Agnes Driscoll, she started keeping things to herself, and she started not sharing information because it was the only way to really secure her position, right? They needed her because she had that information. They needed her because... all else fails, you know, you knew she was keeping something back. So maybe the concern with her in that point was that she was holding on to her cards so tightly to her chest that those were the cards that were needed in order to help program the Bombe machines.
Bombe.
That's what went through my head, too.
There's a song, right? Like, La La Bombe.
There's... Yeah.
Ba-da-ba-la-la-bamba.
It's like a dance. Oh.
Yeah. It's essentially Dance With Me.
So it mentions in that first chapter as well that the Enigma had a few weaknesses. And so one of the weaknesses is that no letter can be enciphered to itself. Because essentially you're pressing down on a typewriter keyboard and then another letter lights up.
Yeah.
And even if you press the same letter over and over, a different letter is going to light up, but it's never going to be the same letter as you're pressing down. Maybe one of the reasons for that is because your finger's on it. But for whatever reason, you know, like if you're seeing a B in a cipher, the actual letter is not a B.
Yeah, which is, I guess that's actually a pretty useful piece of information if you're trying to crack it. It does only like narrow your options down to like 25 other letters, but...
How many letters are there? I said 24 earlier, but now I'm questioning if it's 24 or 26.
It's 26.
There are 26 letters. However, remember that even on typewriters, they didn't have a W because you do use 2 V's, and there was, there was another one. So they actually did reduce it down to 24 at some point.
Interesting. Well, the typewriters I have a W, but they don't have a 1 or an exclamation point.
What year are they from?
A lot of them didn't have that. I think the electric typewriters, a lot of them did. But it was so easy to do, like a lowercase L and a 1 looked exactly the same. So you just do an L. An exclamation point was a little bit harder because you had to do a comma, backspace, period.
Yeah. I did see they were talking about when the women were constructing the circular rotors for the Bombe, it was 26 slots labeled 0 to 25.
Okay.
Well, there you go. Is that where the 0 point comes from, too?
The 0 point?
0 point?
The 0 counting scale that we start at 0, not at 1?
Oh, I'm not sure.
That might have to do with using less memory.
Going back to binary?
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think the other kind of pattern that existed in the Enigma, or in the Bombe, one of those, whichever one is the actual cipher, is there were these loops.
Oh, yeah.
That existed. So you had like a closed loop that would exist in each cipher. So if you like translated, like if E was mapped to T and T was mapped to W and W was mapped to B, B was mapped to E, that was like a closed loop. A big part of their effort was finding these closed loops of translation because they would show you how you configure the rotors. So I guess like the circular nature of the like rotating thingy within the Bombe mapped directly to the existence of these like closed loops. I'm really curious now to like find a engineering diagram of the Bombe and see like how the actual like rotors and stuff work.
Yeah, I think there's a few good videos on Computerphile. It's either Computerphile or Numberphile. And I've also seen some websites where you can set the rotors on the website and then you can start typing and see how it works.
Huh. I will have to try that.
Yeah, I'll put links in the show notes for that.
Yeah, that would be a fun thing for folks to try at home too. Isn't that kind of amusing that you can probably like model and crack an Enigma code on your like iPad or something, and they needed like a complete room of computers to do it like 100 years ago?
Yeah, I mean, they didn't really have the general purpose computer yet.
That's true. That's a good point.
So yeah, it is super interesting. They're building these like partly mechanical, partly electrical, giant single purpose things that take a whole crew of people to operate, and probably spend like, based on how much it mentioned they're breaking down, spend like half the day fixing it every few days.
Yeah. Sounds like software.
It sounds like software development.
Oh, yes, yes.
But this is like them running the production code.
Oh my gosh, can you imagine? They had no CI, no dev environment, no... We are so lucky to have all these things.
Yeah. I'm like, you mean like 10 years ago? Because, you know, that was life
true.
back then.
Yeah. Oh.
You spoiled kids, you.
I am a spoiled child. I love it.
In the channel, I actually attached a Rutherford journal for the Turing Bombe and the diagrams and descriptions and all sorts of lovely info. So hopefully that will also be attached to the show notes.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, I mean, it basically looks like a typewriter or a cash register with like different things you can plug in the front.
Keep scrolling.
And then like some rotors on the top.
Definitely keep scrolling.
Scrolling. And the Bombe. That looks...
Bombe.
Amazing.
Right? The interior view?
Right, the interior view. It looks like a bomb.
It looks like the cloud.
It looks like a lot of bombs.
You're right.
Oh. I made a terrible joke, but I'm glad no one responded to it, to be honest. This is very bad.
Actually, I totally chuckled on the inside. It was perfect.
So in chapter 13, it talks about how they were planning the invasion on Normandy. And I thought that was pretty cool. They wanted to take the Germans by surprise. And so they had to create these phantom armies. They were like, we know they probably are breaking our codes. So let's make them think we're attacking up north and then like somewhere down south. And then they're going to know about the one at Normandy, but they're going to think that it's not the real attack. when really it was the real attack.
It's almost kind of like hacking their communication systems. And I think we've seen this like throughout the book, is where they would exploit people's trust in the communication system to send incorrect messages, or like send a message with the intent of figuring out their cipher, or send a message with the intent of directing them to an incorrect position, or getting them to like a place where they were indefensible. So there's like this interesting, I think psychological might be the wrong word, but like they're kind of trying to hack each other's systems and trust in their communication protocols, and use the actual like frameworks and things that people have set up against them, which is, I think, really interesting.
Yeah, I think it's really like social engineering, because like you said, they trust it. If you intercept a message and then you crack it, you trust it.
It can't be incorrect. Yeah. Why would anyone encode an incorrect message to us?
Right. And it was super interesting that to send these fake messages, they had to like intimately know what a real message looked like, what a real pattern of communication looked like throughout the day. That was a lot of work. And so kind of the sense I got throughout this part 3 was that the code breakers really won the war for us.
Yeah.
Like, I feel like there's no way we could have won without code breakers, and without them doing like such a good job.
Yeah. I want to almost extend it a little bit and say that technology won the war for us. They were kind of talking about how in addition to, this code breaking apparatus, you had all of the technology that was there to support it. Like developments in sonar was one of the things that they highlighted, and a couple of other things that emerged with the intent of supporting like the intelligence apparatus. So I thought that was cool. And obviously there's like tons of articles and books out there about how a lot of technological innovation comes out of war, because when it comes to killing each other, we'll dedicate all of the resources necessary, unfortunately.
I'm desperate.
Yeah. So I thought that was, you had like this intelligence apparatus, and code breaking was like the nexus, but then this like whole ecosystem of technology in like communications and detection, and like the actual way the ships were constructed came about to support that code breaking effort.
The huge innovations we made on airplanes and air warfare has dramatically furthered our abilities to do things like, fly to the moon or fly to Mars.
Yeah. I was going to say, like, fly to Europe, fly to China.
Yeah. Much closer, but also just as cool almost.
But I mean, we would have eventually gotten there, I guess. We would have eventually gotten to space. But part of the fact that we went from war into a Cold War is what pushed us into space, too. So it wasn't just the ability to travel distances. It was literally the ability to leave our planet.
Yeah, I never thought of that. Space travel is really interesting because I feel like right after the war, when we went to, when we first started going to space and the moon, it's like we were just barely able to do that. And we thought, well, now we're gonna go to Mars. We're gonna go to all these crazy places within a few years. But really, we were just barely able to do that, and it was super expensive.
Yeah.
Yeah, but the Great Space Race due to the Cold War meant that we were, like you said, willing to dedicate every resource possible.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that is like and maybe not a counterpoint, but just something as an analogy to that is when you invest in things, progress happens. Whoa, wild, crazy. Wow. What a strange concept.
Right. Why do we have to wait for war for this to happen?
I think the other thing is that investing in things heavily may not be sustainable. So this can apply to working a lot of overtime, putting in more than 40, 50, 60 hours a week, running yourself ragged. Personally, like as a startup company, it's just, you can do it for a little while.
Then maybe you should allow women into the engineering fields that allow it to happen, so you've got more people, so you don't have to work 40, 50, 60, 70, 80 hours on it. Just hire more people that are qualified.
Yeah. Although throwing more people at a late project makes it later.
Yes. However, training people means you end up with senior devs.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't ever train anyone, you're going to run out of senior devs eventually.
Do we want to do like concluding thoughts on the book, or?
Yeah, let's go for that. Overall thoughts on the book?
I enjoyed the history lesson. I felt that maybe there wasn't enough focus specifically on the code breakers themselves. It was much more of a generic effort across them all, but I certainly learned a lot and got salty for all new reasons.
Got salty?
Oh. Are we going to have Modern Lingo 101?
Got salty?
Fine. So
should I get on Urban Dictionary?
Yes. So being salty is kind of like being bitter towards something or someone. Say nobody invited you to a party and you were like salty about it. You were just like bitter about not being invited to the party.
It's like sassy angry.
Okay. No, I get it. Yeah.
Snarky angry, maybe?
Cool.
It's what the kids are saying these days, Adam.
Okay.
It has been for a little while. Like,
true. I will admit, being salty is kind of a little outdated at this point, but
yeah, which is why I thought, hello, fellow kids, I could get away with it.
Oh my goodness!
Apparently not.
You've got a young one on the panel, so.
And apparently I'm not the oldest one anymore. That now goes to Adam.
Yes.
All right.
So I really enjoyed the book, and it really makes me want to dig into some of these topics, even just into cryptography in general. And I really loved how Dot Braden's story is threaded throughout. I feel like that's kind of the unifying story, whereas other people come in and out of the story a lot. It was also ending on a really happy note that the war was won, but then it kind of shows the other side of it, of how they got older and they couldn't tell anybody. And also how, like, when they were helping kill the enemy, basically, by cracking these codes, they felt no remorse, right? Because they were helping to win the war. And then the sentiment changed after the war, just a few years later. And maybe even like their own daughter would say, how could you do that? How could you help kill all those people? And they started thinking about it like, okay, those Japanese people, they had wives, they had mothers.
Yeah. The PTSD/psychological trauma aspect to it. I can share my thoughts.
Yeah, go for it.
I really struggled with this book, y'all. Maybe it's just because I've been like, busy in my personal life with onboarding to a new job and just like hectic situations that put me in a situation where I wasn't really able to like sit down and focus intently on a book. But I found this really hard to read, even with that in mind. For me, it was just like too many characters to keep track of. I tend to be like very person focused when I read books. I'm really interested in like the people and tracking down their experiences. And like with the book, there were just like so many characters that it overwhelmed me a little bit. They're not characters. They're real human beings who once existed.
I know. I keep saying that. Characters.
Yeah. I would not like to be referred to as a character once I'm dead. I found that aspect of it really hard just for me personally with the way that I like to read books and like process them mentally. And I wish there was, maybe it's not, the focus of a book like this, but just like a little bit more about the actual like code breaking and less about like their day-to-day lives. And I understand that was part of the book, is they wanted to paint a realistic picture of what it was like to be one of these women, and part of history is understanding the boring parts of people's lives and what it was like to be them, but it was also just like so boring. I was like, okay, yeah, they marched a lot for people and dated and like ate in different places. And that was like...
I really enjoyed those parts. But
really?
I'm with you. It was long. And so I struggled to find the time to sit down and read it. Yeah, I liked it. Like the story where they were going to go buy a mattress and then they realized they don't deliver. So they had to like have the guy come home with the mattress on top of his car and then feed him dinner as payment for bringing it home.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what it was. So it's just like it didn't quite appeal to me with this particular book.
But I do want to get into the encryption stuff at some point with some books.
Yeah, like...
I just kind of felt like this book tried to cram too much in. Like, this was the untold story of the women code breakers, so I expected it to be much more focused on the women and their lives and their stories and the things they experienced. And... you know, to understand some of that, you had to understand some of the code-breaking side of it. I just felt like maybe it should have been split into two different books. Like, tell us about the women and then tell us about, like, the code-breaking efforts of the American side of the war.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good perspective on it, too. I do think it would have been much better as, like, a multiple-part series.
And I feel like I would have enjoyed it a lot more if I knew more about the war in general before reading it.
So overall, my rating for it would be like a 3 out of 5, maybe like a 2.75 out of 5 for being extremely pedantic. I did like the fact that it exposed me to tons of new stories that I didn't know about. I did learn lots of new things about the war effort in and of itself that I didn't know about, but the density of all of the characters and all of the information made it really hard to read. It was a mental task to, like, figure out the themes of the book to be able to share them. So,
yeah.
Right? There was just so much. It was hard to say, okay, this is what I want to talk about in this next episode, or this is the piece that I want to talk about. It was just, like, so much information. And at the same time, I have to admit, I read, like, 2,500 pages of book in the last 2 weeks, and... not very many of them were this book, because you kind of had to be in the mood to pick it up and read about a whole bunch of war and 40s and, you know, like dealing with the fact that there was just so much sexism. And so there was like that anger, you know, quality about it. It wasn't exactly the let's read a relaxing book before I go to bed kind of story.
No, it wasn't. And I tried reading this both on paper and ebook version. And it was almost impossible to read it on an ebook because I could not tell when I was getting to the end of anything on the ebook. At least with the physical book, I could hold it and kind of flip forward and see where I was at.
Yeah. I read it on my Kindle. The one thing I do have on my Kindle is the little indicator that says, you know, you've got like 26 minutes in the book or however many in the chapter. So that was like one good measurement. I was like, all right, if I just keep reading, I'll get to the end of this, which... yeah.
But when it said you have 8 hours left in the book, that was not helpful.
Yeah, I do it by chapter instead of by...
yeah.
Because 8 hours left in the book.
All right. Well, thanks for sticking with it and reading it with me. I really enjoyed talking about it.
No, I'm glad you did. And it goes to show, like, we talk about all of these different books. Some might not resonate with us. Others might. It's like subjective. So it's cool to hear your perspective on it, too.
All right. Well, I'll talk to y'all next time. Well, I think we decided the next book we're talking about is Ready Player One.
Hurrah! I've seen the movie, but I have not read the book. So that should be fun.
I've done both, so this will be a nice review.
Nice. Okay, see y'all next time.
All right, see ya, folks.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.